With an 8-15 record on the road at Missouri, I think it's fair to question Eli Drinkwitz on the road, but I don't think it's correct, and I'll explain why on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso, and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. On today's program, I want to talk about an unheralded defender on the Missouri defense that I think is going to make a big difference once again this season. And by the way, an important player, a type of player that needs to make a big step up on the defense this season if the Tigers' front seven is going to be as good as I think it is. And you know what? Before I start the show, I do want to remind you today's episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use the promo code LOCKEDONCollege at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. And you know what? I saw a stat recently that took me a little bit by surprise, and that's that Eli Drinkwitz is 8-15 on the road at Missouri. But I got to say that since it struck me as that, well, poor of a number, more poor than I was expecting anyway, I think it's worth breaking it down because I think it's worth trying to figure out how many of these wins and losses, by the way, to truly hang on Eli Drinkwitz, to give him the blame or the credit, even though a Gary Pinkel coach, any good coach really, is always going to take the blame post-game following a loss in the press conference. But again, I will point out this is a subjective exercise here. Wins and losses are the only objective thing that we can really talk about here. So if you want to disagree with me on some of these, feel free. I am going to show my work here. And in fact, let's go full screen. Let's just start from the beginning here. Let's go to the 2020 schedule for Missouri. Of course, what a bizarre schedule this was. First road game for the Tigers, well, a blowout loss in Neyland Stadium. That was definitely a team that had more talent than Missouri in 2020. The same thing with Florida in Ben Griffin Stadium, by the way. That was a good Florida team with multiple NFL type of players and a team that barely ended up missing the college football playoff, if memory serves correctly. Then you've got a game in Williams-Brice Stadium that Missouri won. Hey, a dub. I'll actually take one dub in this weird 2020 season, no matter how I get it. And, you know, a loss, of course, to Mississippi State as well. To be honest with you, that was a game where Missouri was very short on players because of the COVID situation and, of course, the Music City Bowl. Not a road game, but just to that point, ultimately canceled versus Iowa because of, again, that COVID-19 pandemic, the restrictions and all that stuff. So to me, I actually don't hold any of those particular losses against Eli Drinkwitz. I really don't, and I'd actually give him credit, of course, for the one victory against South Carolina. Again, my thinking here is not that, of course, I'm not trying to convince you that, well, that's a dub for Missouri in those big losses to Florida and Tennessee, for example. I'm just simply giving Drinkwitz a pass because I don't know that Gary Pinkel or even Nick Saban were going to win with those particular rosters, especially in that 2020 season. So let's actually move on to the 2021 season and examine the road games and losses there as well. Lost to Kentucky, of course, in week 2. A bad start by Missouri, but you know what? The Tigers did hang in there. Lost at Boston College 41-34 in overtime. I believe Missouri was a mild favorite there. I'll definitely hang the Boston College loss on Eli Drinkwitz. You may want to hang the Kentucky one on him too. And in fact, let's actually go ahead and do that. Let's be as critical as we possibly can here and give Drinkwitz another loss for the Kentucky game there. So I'm updating my numbers here in real time, by the way, which is why I'm kind of hemming and hawing a little bit here. But in 2021, hey, a nice win over Vanderbilt for Missouri's first road win of the year. Thank goodness that Hail Mary was complete at halftime, and am I right? And by the way, a rare beatdown by Arkansas in Fayetteville that season. The Tigers were also pounded by Georgia. Sorry, let me scroll down a little bit so you can all see that. Pounded by Georgia in the somewhat infamous Tyler Macon game where he started that ball game, and Brady Cook came in briefly at the end of that one. So to me, I'm going to go 1 win and 4 losses. Really, this is the toughest season for Eli Drinkwitz on the road by far, to me, was 2021. As for 2022, well, the losses start to get a little bit better here. A blowout loss by Kansas State. I'm not giving anybody a win or a pass there, obviously. A crazy loss, though, to Auburn, that 17-14 game in overtime. Really, Missouri should have won that game. Just make a short field goal. Hold on to the ball at the goal line. Bunch of ways Missouri could have won that game. I'm going to give Eli a pass there. The same thing with Florida. I think quite simply the Gators were the better team that year. And by the way, the highlight of the season was a road victory, that 23-10 win in Williams-Brice over South Carolina. Now, obviously, that blowout, anytime you lose by 42 in Neyland Stadium, I don't care how much better Tennessee was, that's a loss in my book, ladies and gentlemen. So a couple losses and one important win for Drinkwitz in 2022. And it's important to realize that in 23, that's where things start to turn around. A couple of 38-21 victories at Vanderbilt and Kentucky. A loss at Georgia that I'm going to give Drinkwitz in Missouri a pass for. I think Missouri was plenty competitive in that ball game, and Kirby Smart would agree with me. And by the way, a beatdown of Arkansas. To me, that is a heck of an outcome there. No losses for Missouri that I'm going to hang on Eli Drinkwitz on the road. 3 wins, I would say, as well. Now on to 2024. Hey, the game, of course, in Williams-Brice last season, that's a pass. It's a close game. Missouri lost it at the very last second. I'm going to make that one a pass as well. UMass, that's a terrible team. That's also a pass. You don't get a huge amount of credit there. But the losses at Texas A&M, the losses at Bryant-Denny Stadium against Alabama, I suppose some of you could be nice and say, you know what, Missouri was with its backup quarterback in that game, Drew Pine. But anytime you get shut out, I'm going to hang that on the coach a little bit. And 41-10, that was just truly an embarrassing loss for Missouri, and one that, well, made you realize that their playoff aspirations were probably not going to happen. So I realize I've done some very subjective and weird calculations here, but bottom line, at the end of the day, Missouri, if I'm hanging the wins on Eli and the losses on Eli, the ones that he gets the credit for and the fault, I think it's more like 7-8 with my weird calculations. You can even go 7-7 if you don't want to count the Alabama game where Drew Pine had to start on relatively short notice there. So the important thing here is, though, by my calculations, again, 7-8, 4-2, importantly, in 2023 and 24. No, in my opinion, Eli Drinkwitz and Missouri do not have a road problem. I'm going to chalk up the overall 8-15 record to the growing pains of the program, and quite simply, this Missouri program is on the right trajectory, and I think the results on the road in recent years really speak to that as well. And coming up, an important position on the Missouri defensive line that if it hits, man, the Missouri defensive line is just going to be an absolute problem for everybody in the league. And speaking of problems, well, the Missouri SEC schedule is a brutal, brutal gauntlet, especially the start to it. So let's break that all down for you later in the program. But have you ever wished managing your money felt easier? Well, with Monarch Money, it can. Whether you're growing your savings or planning a big purchase, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. And you know what? Monarch Money is more than just your typical budgeting app. It is a complete financial center, giving you the ability to track all your accounts and investments and spending all in one place. So in addition to managing your money, you're also building your wealth. And I have to say, when I signed up for this, I was surprised not only by just how quickly some different monthly expenditures add up. Well, you might even be surprised to realize that you had some redundancies there as well. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONCollege at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONCollege for half off your first year. So this offseason, I said I thought Chris McClellan was the most valuable player currently on the Missouri roster. Now, I may change my mind by the end of the season on that, but I haven't noticed a lot of my colleagues really agreeing with that particular sentiment. I think some of that has to do, this is just my opinion anyway, with when you play nose tackle, when you play any defensive tackle role on the inside, well, it's just not as flashy of a position as the edge, where you're a lot more likely to make sacks and tackles for loss and all that good stuff. But speaking of Chris McClellan, his running mate there last season with the first string, and a guy who's been around for a while with Missouri and a while in college football in general, Kristian Williams, to me, a guy who is a little bit underrated and maybe underappreciated for similar reasons to Chris McClellan. Also because he was an undrafted NFL free agent. He's trying to make the Denver Broncos as we speak. So his physical profile was never one that was going to be that of a first-round type NFL draft pick. The guy just had a relentless motor, I thought, and continually was productive and made plays on that Missouri interior defense. So the thing is, will Sterling Webb, who's been in this program for a while, Marquis Gracial, who seems like he's been here forever, in my mind, really this is only his fourth year in the program, but I do think it's important for a combination of those guys to at least approximate what Kristian Williams gave us, especially the last three seasons here at Missouri, because that three technique, the guy who's next to the nose, by the way, well, he is more likely than McClellan. McClellan, a guy who does get into the backfield a lot for a nose tackle. Well, that three technique, again, I've said this many times. I always use Chris Jones from the Kansas City Chiefs as a good example of that. But a guy who plays inside and can hopefully make some more TFLs, tackles for loss, and sacks, and just being more disruptive than necessarily a nose tackle who's often going to take on two defenders and hopefully open up space for his teammates. So, again, not the most glamorous position in the world, but a really important one nonetheless. Hopefully Sterling Webb, Marquis Gracial, and others will be able to at least approximate what Kristian Williams has done for Missouri in recent seasons. Now, in most aspects of my life, I'd like to think that, yes, I am indeed the affable weirdo. And affable being the key word there, because I don't like to think that I'm a schadenfreude guy taking pleasure in the misery or misfortune of others, but I do make an exception occasionally for football, because sometimes other people's literal pain is quite enjoyable to me. For example, last season, Khalil Jacobs, a surprise onside kick by, I believe it was Murray State. Maybe it was the Buffalo game. I'm pretty sure it was the Murray State. Either way, one of those two early games where Missouri had a shutout. well, a surprise onside kick was foiled in a very physical manner by one Khalil Jacobs. He absolutely just lit up the kicker who was attempting to recover said football. But regardless, I thought Jacobs was a guy who, when I went back and did a lot of my all-22 footage as I did, especially, all of those home games early in the season last year, I thought Jacobs really popped. I thought he was a good player, and I've read a lot of feature stories on the Missouri beat here this week about really the coaches raving about Khalil Jacobs once again. Now, you may have forgotten during Week 6 against UMass last year on the road, a really inconsequential 45-3 victory for Missouri, unfortunately did have major consequences for one Khalil Jacobs as he tore his pectoral muscle in that game, which ended his season. Now, in just 6 games, by the way, had 3 tackles for loss and a couple sacks. So, again, he had been an important guy on that Missouri defense and appears like he will be once again, despite that maybe being the deepest position on the field right now for the Tigers. Josiah Trotter brought in from West Virginia as the Big 12 Defensive Freshman of the Year. I think everybody expects him to be a highly productive player at Missouri, but I think that has sort of almost caused people to forget that I think Khalil Jacobs was quite the player in his own right before getting hurt last year as well. Oh, and by the way, allow me to clean something up from yesterday. I teased some information about Missouri guys trying to make, not just make NFL rosters, but excel in the NFL as well. Teased it, didn't pay it off. My apologies. Well, unfortunately, Ennis Rakestraw, in his second year with the Detroit Lions, has suffered what sounds like a pretty serious shoulder injury. If you listen to Dan Campbell, the Lions coach, sounds like Rakestraw is going to be out for a while. He hasn't been ruled out for the season or anything like that, and at last check, I hadn't heard a timetable, but again, based on what Dan Campbell was saying, just didn't sound very optimistic. And by the way, Campbell was basically saying, man, I hate it for Rakestraw. It wasn't his fault or anything like that. But, year 2, you're going to be a cornerback in the NFL. Unfortunately, this was and remains a really important season for not only Rakestraw, but I would say Chris Abrams-Drain as well with the Denver Broncos, though the outlook and word on the street so far for Abrams-Drain is definitely more positive and sounds like he may be working his way up the depth chart for one of, if not the best defenses in the entire NFL coming into 2025. Also, Johnny Walker Jr. unfortunately suffered a season-ending injury as well. So, unfortunately, the undrafted free agent there, going to have to give it a try for another season, unfortunately there. But by the way, I do want to talk some Missouri basketball here to end the program, and my goodness, what an absolutely brutal start to the 2025-26 schedule it's going to be for Dennis Gates and company. All I can say is I hope they're ready for it. Hopefully non-con gets them prepared. Let's take a look at what is a brutal schedule coming up right after these quick words. And much has been made about Mizzou's favorable football schedule in the SEC over the past couple of seasons. Well, in basketball, no such favors were given from Greg Sankey and the league office. In fact, let's pull up that schedule on screen for you. This is a graphic from Mizzou basketball, by the way. I don't think they'll mind if I share it with you here. But look how this schedule starts for Missouri basketball on January 3rd, 2026. A home game with the defending national champion Florida Gators. Now, you might be saying to yourself, hey, we won in Gainesville last year. True, indeed. I'm just saying that is as tough of a start as you could possibly imagine, but hey, at least it's at home. Game 2 at Kentucky. I think they've won a few basketball games in their history. Call me crazy. Then at Ole Miss, a team that, Chris Beard seems to be having going in the right direction. So again, Then week 4, or game 4, I should say, we're not in football mode, but a home game against the Auburn Tigers, who made the national semifinals only to lose to the Florida Gators, the eventual national champions. I think all of us remember just how good Auburn was last season. So you couldn't imagine a much more brutal 4-game start to the season. Maybe the Alabama game on the road could have been moved into that Ole Miss slot, and that would have been worse. But other than that, I can't imagine a much more grueling start or just a grueling schedule in general. The more you look at this schedule, you realize, well, at least in Game 5 against LSU, that's a little bit of a reprieve in theory. Again, we'll see how good Missouri and LSU and indeed Kentucky, Ole Miss, Auburn, and Florida are too. But just based on last season, LSU and South Carolina were the only teams in the SEC that did not make the NCAA tournament. And both of those games for Missouri this coming season are on the road. So no real obvious layup victories on this schedule to me. Really, just break it all down. Look at them. Look at every single one of them. You might think Georgia at home. Well, again, Georgia was an NCAA tournament team this past season. We'll see what kind of squad Mike White puts out there this year. But with the transfer portal, I'm not really willing to assume or guarantee anything, that's for sure. It seems like the only guarantee right now is that, once again, SEC basketball is going to be brutal. Probably not as brutal as it was last season. That was an historic type of crop of basketball teams there. But I would suspect that from here on out, the SEC is going to be one of, if not the premier basketball conference in the entire country. And by the way, with Kansas opening its newly refurbished football stadium, which I'm going to be honest with you, looks more like a fancy Major League Soccer stadium than a college football stadium. But hey, that's just me and my incredible anti-Kansas bias. But considering Kansas opening up their new facility this season, Missouri's north end zone refurbishment scheduled to be completed by the start of the 2026 season, well, I've seen quite a few people suggest that, hey, why couldn't these teams have gotten together and flipped? Have Missouri go to Lawrence in 2025, go to Columbia in 2026? Well, I would just say at this point, it's probably a miracle that Missouri and Kansas were able to agree on anything, that this series came back whatsoever. But I have to agree that, yeah, logically that makes all the sense in the world for sure. And before Illinois dropped out of one of its games, actually 2 of the 8 scheduled games, now 6 on the schedule with the Illini in the coming years here. Since the Illini dropped out of a game with Missouri next season, the Tigers were supposed to have 2 road games, one in Champaign, one in Lawrence against Power 4 type opponents. I think that would have made a lot of sense scheduling wise for Missouri to flip it as well. And also with the 6 home games to start the season, wouldn't have been the worst thing in the world to have that one in Lawrence in week 2. But this is how it's playing out. I'm not really complaining about it or anything. And again, it's probably a small miracle with all of the hard feelings between Missouri and Bill Self and everything else that these teams got the rivalry back on track. So let's not get greedy, I guess would be my thought there. And by the way, since I brought up Kansas, one more question I'm going to throw out to the audience. Should I go to Lawrence next year? Should I attend that football game? And I ask because I don't really want to be honest with you. Yes, for the podcast, it would be good if I sat up in the top of the stadium in the end zone, maybe took some all-22 footage. And it is a drivable road game, which is something that doesn't happen a whole lot if you're Missouri and you're in the SEC. But on the other hand, ew. See, there's my counter. Ew. Do I really want to sit in Lawrence, Kansas with all of those people? I don't really think so. I don't really want to spend money there. I think I'm gonna default to the Norm Stewart rule. But you know what? I'll do anything for all of you, the everydayers and the listeners of this podcast. So if you want me to go to Kansas next year, I probably will. The good news is I've got a whole year to figure that out. But thanks again for making Locked On Mizzou your first listen today and for your second listen. Definitely check out my guy, the Scoutmaster, Brian Smith. You're going to want to be the most informed fan on college football with all the rapid changes happening out there. Find the portal on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So until next time, I am John Miller. This has been Locked on Mizzou.